July 6, 1945. Time Ghost Army Brigadier Brent Sapp dedicates this episode to the U.S. Army's 11th Airborne Division. More on that later. What do your people think about the war? Well, conduct polls to find out. Easy enough. However, tweaking the questions in the polls just a little can very much change the results. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, there was still scattered fighting on Luzon in the Philippines, and the Australian advances in Borneo continued. There were also discussions among the bigwigs in American command about what the casualties would be likely to be should the Allies invade Japan in November as planned. There are, of course, still casualties being taken each week in the active fighting. There's even new fighting this week. On the 1st come Australian landings at Balikpapan. This is on the southeastern coast of Borneo by the Strait of Makassar. The heavy preliminary bombardment is by 9 cruisers and 13 destroyers under American Admiral Daniel Barbie, backed by the bombers of the Royal Australian Air Force. 33,000 men from the reinforced 7th Australian Division under General Edward Milford land, supported by planes from 3 escort carriers. Landings here are more similar to those on Tarakan Island than those near Brunei. The terrain allows just a narrow strip of beach for landings, and then an invader must break out into the interior. The Japanese also have prepared defenses here, like Tarakan. The bombardment does a good job of taking care of those, though. The landings come mid-morning and are fairly unopposed, so they have a beachhead by 1 in the afternoon. Area Commander Douglas MacArthur and Australian First Corps Commander Leslie Morshead even come ashore to inspect things. On the 3rd, the invaders take Sepingan Airfield, and by the 5th, have cleared most of the oil-producing local area. The 2 airfields here, Sepingan and Mangar, though pretty bombed out, are goals of the operation. However, the Japanese have set up strong defensive positions in the interior, away from coastal bombardment. They do not plan on easily giving up Borneo. They've been moving their POWs too. A while ago, 2,000 Australian POWs were marched out of their camp in Sandakan. The march finally reaches Ranao this week, but only 6 of those POWs are still alive. The Japanese garrison here, it's in pretty bad shape themselves, although it's generally assumed that they will fight to the end. They're not going to get any supplies, though, since Borneo is totally cut off from any reinforcements. Also, by questioning locals and using captured documents, the Allies have a pretty good idea of the Japanese defense plans. It was clear the Japanese were seeking to fight on ground of their own choosing, ground that was broken, vegetated, and inaccessible to off-road vehicular movement. The relatively open coastal plains around Balikpapan had allowed the Australians to employ their combined arms to maximum effect. Now it would be more difficult to locate enemy emplacements or indirect fire, and make it difficult for tanks to approach positions. There is also news and action in Burma this week. Let me backtrack a bit. After the fall of Rangoon, Bill Slim's 14th Army headquarters relocated to Ceylon, and from there are making plans to retake Singapore and Malaya from the Japanese. A new 12th Army, not a fictional one this time, was formed on May 28th to take over operations in Burma from 14th Army, who are to execute the Malaya and Singapore plan to take place later this summer. That's Operation Zipper. To form 12th Army, they've just redesignated Indian 33rd Corps under Montague Stopford. This includes Frank Messervy's 4th Corps in the Sitang River Valley and divisions in the Irrawaddy River Valley. Anyhow, by now, Japanese 28th Army under Shozo Sakurai, retreating and consolidating from Arakan and the Irrawaddy Valley, has reached the Pegu range of hills and mountainets between the Sitang and Irrawaddy rivers. They're kind of trapped here by the enemy, so they've been planning to break out, link up with the remnants of Haitaro Kimura's Burma Area Army, and escape into Thailand. This breakout is going to be covered by the remnants of Japanese 33rd Army, now about the size of a brigade, who are to launch a diversion across the Sitang. British intelligence knows the Japanese are planning this, but not exactly where it's going to happen. So Messervy has 4th Corps spread out over 150 or so kilometers of the front. They have a piece of luck this week. On the 2nd, a Gurkha patrol ambushes a Japanese unit and captures a bag of dispatches that has the entire operational plan in it. It seems Sakurai will be advancing on the Sitang in 3 columns in complete silence, no radios, and only bayonets for attacks, and plans to cross it on bamboo rafts. One of these columns is to go right by the headquarters of the 17th Indian Division and Penwegon, so Messervy reinforces here. On the 3rd, the diversion by 33rd Army hits the Sitang Bend. This is really bad timing though, since 28th Army isn't supposed to start their advance until next week. And since the British are aware of this, they allow the Japanese to advance until a lot of them are in exposed positions. Then first massed artillery and Spitfires and Thunderbolts after that rain fire on the Japanese over the next few days. Tomorrow, Kimura orders the remnants of 33rd to pull back, hoping their diversion has done enough diverting. We'll see soon enough, I imagine, but the British know what's going on. I mentioned last week that the Luzon campaign on the Philippines is effectively over. What I mean is this: though Tomoyuki Yamashita's Shobu group has like 65,000 men left, and maybe 50,000 could be called an organized force, they have no thoughts or even the possibility of any counterattack, and indeed lack the real capability of concentrating force. Yamashita only plans to make harrying or delaying actions that might in some way hold up the Allied invasion of Japan. It's a big area that he has men in though, mostly scattered in the mountains of the Cordillera Central or the land stretching down east and north of Baguio and Santa Fe. Ferreting them out are the 66th Filipino-American Regiment heading south on Route 11 and elements of the 32nd Division heading north along the Agno River and Route 11. I imagine they will link up later this month. There is another Allied landing on Mindanao this week, near Davao, which helps to further isolate and restrict the scattered Japanese left there. This week on the 5th, Douglas MacArthur announces that the Philippines have been liberated, which isn't quite true, only mostly true. So things look bad for the Japanese all over, as they do every week by now, and it certainly doesn't seem like they have a hope of winning this war. I mentioned last week that there are those in the American government who think that maybe the demand of unconditional surrender of the Japanese could or should be modified to allow Emperor Hirohito to remain as emperor, thinking that Japanese devotion to him could be very useful post-war, while trying him as a war criminal could have a serious negative effect. They think Japanese militarism is really a consequence of the Depression allowing military extremists to come to power, and getting rid of such militarism is doable. Joseph Grew, American Undersecretary of State, is sort of leading the charge on this one. He and guys like former President Herbert Hoover and guys who were anti-interventionists before the war think that the US provoked Japan during the late 1930s, and that was unnecessary. Well, that is the polite way of saying what they think. Hoover, for example, calls Franklin Roosevelt's policy of embargo something devised by a madman. Go back and watch our Pearl Harbor miniseries for too much detail on that history. But Hoover's opinion is at the extreme end, although most conservatives believed that the emperor would contribute to Japan's rehabilitation by providing a stable link to the past and a focal point of loyalty in difficult times. In this view, removing the emperor would be a disastrous mistake that would provoke resistance from the Japanese people and necessitate a lengthy and costly military occupation by the United States. As for that occupation itself, though, there are several schools of thought. Grew thinks it necessary. Hoover thinks the idea is stupid. William Leahy leans towards Hoover and thinks that if they absolutely must do it, U.S. forces should only have a minor role so most of them can come home. Grew has been pushing the idea of leaving the emperor at his post, but by now he has found himself completely thwarted from an unexpected source: former Secretary of State Cordell Hull. Hull was Secretary of State for 11 years under Roosevelt, though he resigned last November because of health issues. And while President Harry Truman may not have specific regard for say, Herbert Hoover, when it comes to politics, he sure does have regard for Hull. It was Hull who received Japan's declaration of war in December 1941, and Hull who was there the whole war after that, and Hull who sees absolutely no reason to compromise with the Japanese, and absolutely no reason to trust them. Hull is willing to concede that Hoover has raised an interesting issue with regard to ending Japanese militarism, but that's it. And as he wrote to Truman June 12, there's no point to discuss any of these questions to which Mr. Hoover refers to in his appeasement proposal. That's pretty heavy. Hull is warning that those guys are pursuing a course which could be equated with appeasement. For the moment, then, there is no modification of unconditional surrender. The actual current Secretary of State, Edward Stettinius, thinks that the idea of sending a warning to Japan that also helps to clarify what unconditional surrender means, without any softening of it, should wait until after the terminal conference in Potsdam, supposed to begin July 17th, and then be issued by the US, USSR, Britain, and China together to give it real bite. That is now scheduled to be a topic of discussion at the conference, much to Gru's disappointment. But what do the American people really want? Okay, they want their guys to come home. We know that. In polls, in terms of what to do with the emperor, though, 3% of the public think he should remain in place and be governed through by the U.S. 33% want his execution. 11% think life imprisonment, and 17% want to see him put on trial. Now, a majority of Americans do say they want Japan's unconditional surrender. Total victory over Japan. However, the Cantril organization, which does public opinion research, which is a pretty new field, did a poll a couple weeks ago that shows that only 27% of responders want a prompt invasion, and 58% want American aerial and naval power to bring Japan to the brink of starvation before such an invasion. The thing about polls, though, is that depending how they're presented, they can really show people's concerns about casualties. Cantril did a poll where the options were either making peace with Japan if Japan gives up control of any of China and any Pacific islands, or continuing to fight them at the cost of a few 100,000 American soldiers. Here is 56% want to fight and 37% for peace. But the same poll, but without mentioning any casualties, has 85% wanting to continue the fight. There was also a big poll done in June of 2,075 soldiers in the states back from overseas duty. They are asked if they support a fight until Japan is totally defeated, or a peace in which both sides would have something to say about the peace terms. Here, while there are hundreds of undecideds, the Japan totally defeated faction wins 1,332 to 201. But when asked if they should continue their service in the war, 1,248 say they should be discharged now. 381 said they should serve longer, but not all the way until the defeat of Japan. In other words, the majority thought that the job of subduing Japan should be someone else's. That response is understandable, given that nearly all of the participants in the poll had earned at least one combat star, and the vast majority had 2 or more. It seems clear that the GI's commitment to unconditional surrender had to be qualified by the knowledge that most of the soldiers participating in the poll believed they would not be sent to the Pacific. But one thing we do see, despite Army Chief of Staff George Marshall and other Joint Chiefs believing that a siege policy would prolong the war and the public would lose support for it, is that here in early July 1945, public opinion polls strongly show a solid commitment to the war and to what winning it entails. Heck, less than a month ago, June 8th, a Gallup poll showed that 77% of those polled said Congress should wait until after Japan is defeated before lowering income taxes. There is that undercurrent of strikes and unemployment from wartime industries closing up shop, and there are many, many letters calling for loved ones to come home now, or decrying the number of casualties on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. But all this together has made a weird shift that's really taking effect pretty much right now. The growing conviction of the inevitability of Japan's defeat, and horror at its cost made the Pacific War seem more repugnant and less meaningful than the war against Germany. As a result, after VE Day, the public focus shifted from Europe to reconversion rather than to Asia, as Americans began a difficult transition to a civilian economy. Well, Congress passes the Army's $39 billion budget this week, and Truman upholds the point system for demobilization, which I've talked about a couple times before, which are both setbacks for those worried about the growing and possibly soon-to-come critical labor shortages at home. And here are a few notes to end the week. On the 5th, British elections are held. The results will not be available until the 26th because they have to bring home and count all the soldiers' votes from abroad. That same day, Britain and the US recognized the National Unity Government as the official government of Poland. Today, the 6th, Norway declares war on Japan. There's also this. Today, July 6, 1945, American President Harry Truman boards the heavy cruiser Augusta to cross the Atlantic to Antwerp. He is heading to the Terminal Conference in Potsdam, Germany, where he will meet with the leaders of Britain and the Soviet Union, the Big Three, to plan the future. Truman has been anxious about this lately, not because he doesn't want to meet up, but because he wants to make sure the new American superweapon, an atomic bomb, has been tested before the meeting so they know it works and he can use it as a trump card in negotiating with Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. He's considered even trying to delay the meeting until after he knows it works. He is repeatedly assured by General Leslie Groves, who runs the Manhattan Project that created the bomb, that by the time he gets to his destination, and thanks to round-the-clock work by engineers and scientists, a plutonium bomb, a single weapon that can release enormous amounts of destructive energy, will have been tested and will work. He can do with that information as he sees fit. As I said, Time Ghost Army Brigadier Brent Sapp dedicates this episode to the U.S. Army's 11th Airborne Division, which is currently fighting as the battle winds down on Luzon in the Philippines. Brett wrote up a draft for this memorial explaining his attachment to this division, and it's so good that we just decided to leave it as it is. So here is what Brett says. When I was young, during a visit to New York City, I saw my first aircraft carrier, USS Intrepid. Hearing her story as we toured through the hangar and living quarters, seeing the aircraft, the guns, and the uniforms, I instantly became engrossed not just in the ship or in the Navy, but the Pacific campaigns of World War II as a whole. When I was older, I joined the MCJ ROTC, that's the Marine Corps Junior Reserve Officer Training Corps, at my high school, and my fascination with the Marines grew further. I saw them as tough men who had to do terrible things to win the war in the Pacific because, no matter what, their enemies were even worse. Until fairly recently, I had never thought much about the Army, which had to come in behind the Marines and slog through the battlefields of the South Pacific. That changed partly thanks to this series. Even more recently, I learned in detail about the 11th Airborne Division, the only Army airborne division to fight in the Pacific, through a couple of other YouTube channels, but especially the historian Jeremy C. Holm, who is the grandson of 11th Division Lieutenant Andrew Carrico. In particular, he researched in detail the Los Baños prison camp raid, which freed 2,000 civilians held captive and starved by the Japanese. I had never heard of this before because I, like many others, was more drawn to the events of the same day on Iwo Jima, when U.S. Marines raised the American flag atop Mount Suribachi. I have no family who fought in the war, no hometown heroes beyond volunteers and dockyard workers. So instead, I would like to dedicate this episode to Holm and the 11th. Holm has sought to ensure that the 11th's role in the war is not forgotten, and, for whatever it is worth, I would like to dedicate this episode to helping in his goal. Never forget. If you would like to memorialize an episode of this series, you can do so by joining the Time Ghost Army at Brigadier level for 1 year or by making a one-time donation. You can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.